Hey preachers, welcome to Unit 5 of our course. We only have 3 weeks left, and this week we are focusing in on the issue of how to select a text when preaching. And particularly for those of you that are preaching regularly, that maybe even preaching weekly, you know that, as one of my professors would often say, Sunday comes quicker than sermons. So we want to be prepared because sometimes we're not as prepared for Sunday. And so we want to look at what it means to select a biblical text on a regular basis in a faithful way to how God is speaking to us. So just going to spend a few minutes here during this video as we introduce the subject at hand. You have some reading. Of course, you also have some assignments to be thinking through this. But there's two primary ways that you're going to be selecting a text to preach on. The first one is you're going to go to the scriptures to think about a topic, not a topic, but a scripture passage that's going to give you the thrust of your message for that sermon. So, for example, you or your leadership team might be saying, this spring or this fall or this summer, whenever it is during the year, we want to do a 10-week series on the book of Hebrews. And so you're going to work with them through the book of Hebrews to think about what are the 10 most important passages or the 10 passages that are going to help our listeners, our congregation, get the thrust of what Hebrews is saying. The advantage of that is that you don't have to give context for Hebrews every single week. Because if you're preaching in Ezekiel 1 week and Hebrews 1 week and then Genesis and Romans, and you just kind of jump back and forth on various weeks, almost every time you have to give a lot of historical background on maybe who wrote the book or what their context was. If you take a book like Hebrews or let's say 1 Corinthians, we know a lot about the church at Corinth at that time that Paul was writing to. Well, at the beginning of that series on 1 Corinthians, for example, you can talk about some of the historical nature of the church and what some of the issues were that can hopefully kind of carry forward throughout the series. Now, of course, not everybody's going to be attending church all 10 weeks for the most part. You'll have a few, but most of our folks are here 1 week and gone the next. And so we want to be careful that we don't assume too much foreknowledge. You'll have to probably give a little bit of historical background or a little bit of review of the things that you may have preached before. But the idea is that one way to preach is to pick a particular scriptural passage and then preach out of it. The nice thing about this is that often you're going to the text fresh and new. We talked about this a little bit last week with exegesis, how we don't want to necessarily take what we think about Scripture and just throw it onto the passage. We want the passage to speak to us first, and then out of that we can speak to our people. And so by picking a particular book or particular Scripture passages, you're really not having a preconceived notion of what you're going to preach or what your title is or your topic or things like that. You're spending time with the text, engaging with the text, and then out of that comes a message for God's people. The great thing about that, if you take like a book of Hebrews, is that you're really getting to know the author and what the author says. The disadvantage of that sometimes is that especially if you don't use a book, if you are kind of in Genesis 1 week and Romans and you're kind of back and forth, there's not always kind of a clarity that comes with week after week after week. It's sometimes you're in so many different directions, whereas in series preaching, often people like the idea of having 2 or 3 weeks or 4 or 6 weeks where you kind of focus in on 1 or 2 main topics or main thrusts. And so that's kind of the other extreme. Another way to preach is to do more topic or what you might be called pastoral preaching in that way. And so topic preaching is where the preacher's choice, the preacher is choosing a topic, an issue at hand, and they're going to go to the scriptures and find a passage that speaks about this issue in order to speak to their people. The advantage of this is that you really know the pulse of your congregation. And so right now there's so many different issues that's going on in our world. You can pick up the newspaper and there's so many things that are going on. If you're doing a series on the book of Hebrews right now, you may not be able to speak in the same way to those issues. Whereas if you said, you know what, I saw this in the newspaper on Monday, or this is what my community is facing, and I want to preach on this, on whatever particular issue is happening. And so it gives the preacher some more flexibility to speak to particular needs of their congregation. Of course, the disadvantage of that is that if you're always speaking to their perceived needs, things that people think they want to be spoken about or that they need to hear, that sometimes you're missing the total view, the total theology and witness of Scripture. Sometimes as preachers, they often say that the preacher only has one good sermon, and they just preach that all the time in a number of different ways, but you're always preaching about the same issue. And so sometimes as preachers, we will stay away from texts that maybe we don't think will address certain contemporary issues, or that we're kind of afraid to preach out of. And so there's a hesitancy there if you're in a tradition where the preacher is always choosing for themselves. Sometimes you want to push yourself beyond that. You may want to force yourself to do a series on the book of Revelation or the book of Esther or 1st and 2nd Kings, or something that would maybe you wouldn't normally preach out of, but it would kind of give you the discipline to learn, and what can you take out of some of these different stories that you have. So there's some advantages and some disadvantages to both ways of Scripture. This particular year at my congregation, we're doing a year-long series called 53 Stories, and there's 53 Sundays in this year, and so we are actually preaching out of 53 of what we consider the top Bible stories of the year, of stories that we want our congregation to know. And so we've kind of broken it down into series in the sense that it fits in with, let's say, Epiphany, the beginning of the year, or Lent. We'll, of course, have stories surrounding Advent and Christmas at some point. And so, for us, this is a good series where each week I'm given a particular scripture passage, and I don't necessarily have a contemporary need that I'm speaking to, though if there are issues that are going on that I think need to be spoken about, then I can try and apply that from the text. But primarily I'm preaching more from a biblical perspective, in the sense that I'm going to the scriptures first, that we've already planned this out for the entire year. But again, there's disadvantages to that, where there's more flexibility sometimes when we can pick a series for our congregation. Just a few suggestions about as you pick these things. As I mentioned earlier, try to expand beyond what you normally do. If, let's say, you're primarily a preacher that goes to the scriptures first, maybe you want to spend a month sometime in 1 year where you would try and pick out a theme or a topic, and you would try and kind of flesh that out and look at scriptures that relate to that. If you're primarily a topical preacher, maybe you want to do a 4 or 8 week series on a book of the Bible, or some theme that goes throughout Scripture to kind of help you expand yourself. One great thing to do is to get together with your leadership team, whether that's a leadership team at the church, a leadership team for a youth group, or whatever context you're preaching in, and spend some time and say, what are our congregation's needs? What are the questions that they're asking? What are the things that they're wrestling with right now? And so rather than just thinking about it for yourself, get some other people that are part of the congregation, that are listening to other people, other members of your congregation, figuring out what is it that they're wrestling with, that they're struggling with. And then you can begin to form preaching series, or you can go to Scripture and try and find something that speaks to those needs as well. On Moodle and the material that we have, they're going to emphasize more of a biblical model for preaching, and I think that's fair in the sense that we want to make sure we're preaching biblically. We're not just going to perceive needs and neglecting the truths of Scripture. I think at the same time, you can preach topically, you can preach out of contemporary issues, if you do so in a faithful way. If you do what we talked about last week, and do the right exegetical processes. There's been times where I thought I wanted to preach on a particular topic because it was a topic that I thought our congregation needed to hear and wanted to hear, or it was a contemporary issue that was going on. I picked my text, I wrestled with the text, and the text defeated me in a sense, where I couldn't make the text say and speak into that contemporary situation what I wanted it to. And so I had to change. As the preacher, I had to use that text in a way that was more faithful to the text rather than use it for my own, what I thought it was trying to say. It wasn't that I was trying to be heretical or anything, but I had thought it would mean one thing, but once I got to studying with it and wrestling with it, it actually meant something just a little bit different. And so you might experience that too. So don't pigeonhole the Scriptures. Let the Scriptures speak to you in that way. I would love to hear from you about the different ways that you preach, whether you're more of a kind of going to the Scriptures or if you're more of a topical preacher on contemporary issues. Feel free to post on Moodle or email me that. If you have any questions about this or any recommendations or resources that you use as a preacher for particularly picking out a text, I'd be happy for you to share that with me and with the rest of the class. Enjoy Unit 5 and continue the good work.